everybody just do your thing.
Wake up, today's gonna be a good day. Wake up, today's gonna be a good day. Wake up, today's gonna be a good day.
Welcome, fabricators. Last week we talked about how to do an incremental copy job with a watermark, but today what we're going to do is we're going to cover an incremental copy job using change data capture. There were a couple really interesting things that we found out last time. If I used a data warehouse to be able to copy my data, it was only going to be able to append like a slowly changing dimension. If I wanted to do a merge to be able to merge those inserts updates, I could do that. But the second I did a delete, the deletes were not copied up. And this is what we're going to fix. We're going to go through the whole thing. We're going to test this, but we're also going to see how we can get this replicated throughout OneLake and accessible in a warehouse, accessible in a lakehouse, and it's all via the mirror. Keep in mind that we only have a few sources we can use for the CDC destination. We can only use Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instance, or Fabric SQL Database. And Fabric SQL Database is the key right there. Fabric SQL Database automatically has a mirror that mirrors itself into OneLake. And so, because we have that mirror data is available on our SQL Analytics endpoint, and we can make a shortcut into a lakehouse, or we could use a 3-point naming convention to access it via DW. The main thing that we want to make sure that you understand is that regardless of how we get the data in, we have it accessible all over Microsoft Fabric. So, enough talking about this. Let's go look at this great content together. I'm in my Microsoft Fabric workspace, and you can see we've got our Fabric SQL Database, we've got our warehouse, but I've also added a lakehouse. And that's important because what I want to make sure that we understand is any data we use in the Fabric SQL Database, we're also getting within the warehouse and the lakehouse because of the mirror. Now, I've deleted the table that we had last time. We're starting from scratch because we're going to start with a CDC table this time. So let's go over into SQL Server. And you can see we're starting with our on-premise SQL Server in my incremental copy job database. I also have a connection to my Fabric SQL endpoint on the SQL database endpoint, which is my read-write connection, and a connection to the SQL Analytics endpoint. This is the mirror database, but we're going to be able to access this via the lakehouse and via the data warehouse, because the main concept is if I get the data in Fabric, I have it in all of Fabric. So these different panes are representing where these queries are going to be running. First thing I need to do is enable CDC for my database. It's already enabled, but this is the command I would run if I needed to enable it. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a create table statement. I've got a drop if exists, but the table isn't there right now. And then what do we need to do? We need to insert some data. So I'm going to put 50,000 rows into the table. Now, after I do this, let's do a quick select star, because what I want to double check is I want to double check that we've actually got our data in there, right? So let's go ahead. We'll do a select star because the next step after this, 50,000 rows, all my data is there, timestamps, yay. We need to enable CDC for the table. So let's go ahead and let's execute this. You can see first, I can run this query against this tables, and CDC was not enabled. I just created the table. Now we've enabled CDC. So let's go back and let's rerun our query and validate that CDC is turned on. It is turned on for my table 1. Now we can go back over to Fabric and we can create our copy job. So let's go ahead and do a new item. I'm going to enter in copy job, there we go, copy job right there. And let's call this exactly what this is. This is on-prem CDC to Fab SQL. Now we cannot do a CDC into a lakehouse or into a warehouse. So we go into Fabric SQL Database. We pull from our on-prem. I'm going to put in the connection information, just like last time, Avengers Tower, incremental copy job for my database. It's going to find this connection because we had created this in the previous video. I've got 2 connections in there. So I'm going to choose the one that's using my on-premise data gateway. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select, you can see we automatically get some CDC tables, but my table has CDC as an icon beside it. And that's what we want. We're picking up this CDC table. Now let's go ahead and we're going to click next. We're going to choose our destination, which is of course our copy into Fab SQL Database. We click on this. It's going to auto load the database up. And you can see I'm going to look at the update method. Merge is already selected because this is what we have for CDC. My key column is already selected, which is what we need for the default table. I'm going to click next. And one of the things that we're going to find is that all the tables have CDC enabled. Now, this is what we're looking for. It's an incremental copy job. If I even try and hover over full copy, I can't even select it. All the tables have CDC enabled for inserts, updates, and deletes, and that's really, really important. I'm going to go ahead and set this to run once because we're going to run this on demand as we go through this, and I'm going to click Save and Run. Okay, so here we are. We're triggering this for the first time. I'm going to fast forward through this every time we have to run it because we're going to run the copy job a couple times as we make different changes. 1 minute, 1 second. Now let's go into our Fabric SQL database because this is going to be part of the key. I'm going to refresh and see that my table has been created. There's my data with all in my table, and I'm going to go to replication. I'm going to go to monitor replication. Now this populates the mirror. You're going to need to run this a couple times because initially what it's going to do is it's going to create the schema, and this is auto copying the data from the Fabric SQL database into the mirror. Just like database mirroring, we have this by default with the Fabric SQL database. So once it happens, we've got our schema, we've got 50,000 rows replicated. Now I'm going to go to my Lakehouse, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how we access this data. I'm going to go to Get Data. I'm going to go to Create a New Shortcut. I'm going to go into Microsoft OneLake. I'm going to select my Fabric SQL database. I'm going to click Next. We go to Tables. It's going to give us the schema, DBO, my table 1. Click Next. Boom, there we go. There's our shortcut. So we go ahead and we create this. And now, once this is provisioned, I can just click on the table. There's my preview. I've got my data accessible to Spark notebooks. I've got it accessible in my Lakehouse on the SQL Analytics endpoint. But let's do this for the data warehouse because data warehouse doesn't have the concept of shortcuts, but it does have the capability to do a 3-point naming convention to anything on the SQL Analytics endpoint, and the mirror's there. So I'm going to create a view, and I'm going to have this statement, select star from copy into Fab SQL my mirror .schema dbo .mytable1. We run this real quick and you can see we get all the data back. A little Fabric magic right there, right? So let's create the view. So now I've got a view and I've got a shortcut in Fabric. So let's do a quick count against my SQL Server. And now I'm going to do a count against the read-write Fabric SQL database. Everything matches. Now let's look at the SQL Analytics endpoint, but let's do a little prep first. I'm going to use the use statement because we can do that. This isn't, Azure Synapse Analytics where we couldn't use the use statement for database. So I'm going to say, let's look at the DW copy job, the warehouse that we have. Let's copy this statement. And now we're going to just update it to be able to use the Lakehouse that we created. And remember, we've got a shortcut in there to my table 1. Same data. Now we can go ahead and we can take this and we're going to copy this. Well, I'm going to say use, and then I'm going to say copy into Fab SQL because that's the name of the mirror on the SQL Analytics endpoint, the name of the database. And then I'm going to be able to use the statement. Now let's label this so that way it's more obvious as we go along. We're going to add the warehouse, the Lakehouse, and the mirror. So that way we know which one of these statements we're always running. So again, if we go back up to the data warehouse, it's pulling from the mirror. So we know the data is up to date. So let's come back over and now let's make some changes. First thing we're going to do, same thing we did last time. Let's update 25,000 rows. I'm going to replicate C 25 times on every row that's divisible by 2. I'm going to do a select star and we can see that my changes have been made. Now let's run the copy job to be able to pull this data from our on-prem SQL Server. We'll fast forward through this again and get it up into our Fabric SQL database. This processes and we get 25,000 rows, just like I would expect. Now let's go back into the Fabric SQL database. We'll go over to monitor replication and we're going to wait for this to load. And then we're going to hit refresh. Boom, a little bit more Fabric magic right there. 25,000 rows replicated. So we can see that the replication has occurred. Now we've already got this on our SQL Server. So now let's check it out. Let's go over to our Fabric SQL database. We see that's working. And now let's look at the data warehouse. Same data. Let's go to the Lakehouse. Same data. And let's go to the mirror. Once again, you're going to find the exact same data because the Lakehouse and the data warehouse get their data from the mirror. This is the concept I want us to understand. While we may only have Fabric SQL database as our destination source, it's in OneLake. We can get all of it. So now let's do our next step. I'm going to insert 50,000 rows. I'm going to update every row that's divisible by 2. We're going to have 75,000 updates, and I'm going to change it to where the column now has W instead of C. We go back over to Fabric, our copy job, refresh. When this comes in, we're going to see the number of rows that this has, 75,000 rows written. Let's go back over to SQL. Let's go ahead and go to the Fabric SQL database because our copy job is completed, and we can run this and we can see the data is up to date. And now let's do the same things. Let's go to the data warehouse and we'll see that our data is up to date. Boom, 100,000 rows. No append only this time because we're pulling from the mirror and we've got all of this covered in Fabric SQL. Same for the Lakehouse, exact same data replicated, looking exactly the same, and it all came from the mirror. Okay. Now, let's do the thing that didn't work last time. This is the big one. This is the thing CDC promised us. Deletes. I'm going to delete 250 rows. So now we're at 99,750. Let's go back over to our copy job. Let's run it. And as this processes, this time, last time we got 0 rows when we just did merge. This time, a little bit of Fabric magic, 250 rows. So that means if we come back over, let's look at the Fabric SQL database. We run the query, deletes were respected, 99,750. For the data warehouse, 99,750. For the Lakehouse, 99,750. I got a little ahead of myself, but we know what it's going to be, right? And now let's go to the mirror, 99,750. Boom. That's Fabric magic. Okay, so what do we need to understand, and what is our big takeaway from this? If I write it to a Fabric SQL database, because I write it to the mirror, I write it to OneLake and I have it accessible in any source that I want to be able to use within Microsoft Fabric. That's a big deal to me. Is it a big deal to you? Well, sound off. Let's keep this conversation going. You know where I want to hear from you? Down in the comments. Are you impressed with this? Do you think this is cool? We have that CDC functionality. We have to use Fabric SQL database, but the great thing is we can use that CDC functionality and have it all throughout Microsoft Fabric in our OneLake. All right. Thank you so much for joining us on Tales from the Field. As always, be good one another out there. Bye, everybody.
I got shit to do, the aftermath of preparation. Good food, good mood, blood in circulation.